So, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us here for today's webinar with the wonderful Emily Gascoigne from Synergy Farm Health. Today, Emily's going to be talking about sheep farming and sustainable practices, friend or foe. And I just want to tell you a little bit about Synergy and Emily before we continue with today's session. So Synergy Farm Health, where Emily Gascoigne is a shareholder, is a proudly independent practice delivering quality healthcare and specialist advice for herds and for flocks. Emily herself graduated in 2012 and has worked at Synergy Farm Health throughout her career. Whilst enthusiastic about all aspects of farm animal practice, Emily has a specialist interest in sheep and goat production, with particular emphasis on flock health planning, reducing production losses, and infectious disease control. Emily gained the European Diploma in Small Ruminant Health Management in 2018 and is an RCVS recognised specialist in sheep health and production. As well as being a shareholder in the business, Emily is also regional vet lead for Synergy's Central region. So, Emily, welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning.
No, yeah, good. Glad to be here. Thank you for that introduction.
Well, it's really great to have you. So, without further ado, Emily, I'm going to hand over to you for your session presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. So just to give the headline probably away from the beginning, and just tell you a little, just something else which might be helpful to understand about me and my context, I suppose. So what I wanted to talk about during this webinar was just sort of really the principle that I think sustainable practices, and in inverted commas or buzzword, however you want to wrap it up, that sometimes that can be quite a triggering discussion for us as farmers and even vets sometimes. And what I just wanted to sort of challenge us to think about is actually really is a lot of the things that fall under the umbrella of sustainable practices we're probably doing quite a lot of them anyway, or to recognise how that they're actually probably not in conflict with the attitudes and mentality we have on farm. It just might mean that there's some nuances or legislative things which might make it feel a bit more threatening to us sometimes, but actually how, if we reflect on our sheep businesses, it's always been there as a friend, and we shouldn't be afraid of it. It just might mean we have to flex a little bit more. So that's really what I want to talk about today. I have a slightly different, quite an unusual perspective in that I am first and foremost a vet, and I am a sheep vet. For context, my practice is in the dairy heartlands of the southwest, but my clinical caseload is 90% sheep, and I do a little bit of beef suckler work as well, but a significant part of my brain power is ovine focused. But I'm also farming at home with my family, and we've got 500 ewes plus suckler cows, and we've got autumn lambing Dorsets, so I'm skiving lambing at the moment, spring Romneys, and then I've got my Hebrideans, which are a great source of amusement for my clients. So I can and we've been presented with a lot of this evolution, so I can see it from different perspectives, and there's some of my Poll Dorsets grazing some gorse. So I think particularly for sheep production, some of the discussion about sustainability can be quite triggering, and often sheep don't always come out that favourably in the face value and initial discussions, and that can be really difficult as a farmer to listen to, and also as a vet to listen to, because I can certainly testify to how hard all of us work to do the best job that we can with our landscape and with really good quality food production in mind. So sometimes it can feel it can be very, very, very difficult to listen to. But I think one of the things that it's really important to recognise is, while some of that discussion is really difficult for us to listen to, it's also quite challenging for the people that buy our products to listen to as well, in terms of our consumers and the pressure that they might be faced at the point of purchase, notwithstanding price and everything else that comes as part of the purchasing choice. But actually, what they're reading about in the media, perhaps not having the full picture of actually how sheep meat, if we're picking on that in particular, is produced. And some of these clips now are quite old, but the messaging still stands. You know, red meat gets a bit of a hammering depending on which paper you read, and actually there's, you know, it's not always actually fair when we look at the nuances of where perhaps some of these headlines have come from, or actually the full context of what we're doing as producers. But I think a couple of numbers that we definitely can't escape from is the commitment to reduce emissions by 64% across agriculture by 2050, and that livestock will need to, it's not distinguished by sector, and that livestock will have to contribute towards that. But another really important number is our aspiration to maintain, if not develop, and at least a 60% self-sufficiency in terms of homegrown food, and ultimately all of these things potentially, you know, they do need to be balanced. And farming, although there are lots of other sectors that contribute really very significantly in terms of fuel consumption, for example, and what that impact that does on the UK's overall carbon footprint, livestock, we cannot escape, still has an important role to play. Now, these are just signposts to the first bit of homework reading if you haven't already read it, the CL report. But this is just one example of where different livestock products are compared in terms of their carbon footprint, and in this case, their global warming potential. And actually, you know, we can't escape that lamb and beef, particularly from the suckler herd, in contrast to other sources of protein. If you're just interested in numbers, if you're a member of the general public just looking at that table, you know, it's a difficult story, isn't it? However, and metrics are really important. We have to have a line in the sand. We have to be able to compare both nationally, internationally. But actually, there's nuance here that a straightforward number certainly doesn't consider. And there's a story particularly that needs telling with regards to sheep production in this context. So, for example, those metrics don't take into consideration, well, at face value, the story doesn't take into consideration, and depending on which carbon footprint measure you use, there's a variation depending on whether they consider sequestration, so carbon that's being locked up on farm, which is hugely important when we start considering our hills, uplands, conservation grazing projects, for example. Some of the headlines at face value also don't take into consideration the arable land that's required to support a given sector. We are a proudly forage-based system in the sheep sector. We are a grass-based industry, and actually we're grazing quite often marginal ground which can't produce protein for humans in other ways, and a really high quality protein at that. But tables at face value don't necessarily consider that. Also, perhaps some of those figures at face value don't consider the relative fuel dependency of each sector, and really the landscapes that we're looking at. Also, I think something that's really important to me, I know, is the communities, the skills, the history, the social capital that's there in our sheep farming. And whilst we can't get too romantic about it, you know, we are facing that climate challenge. There's knowledge in our communities, in our sector, of, you know, because we're custodians of that space, and it's something we're all pretty proud of. So tie all of that in together. A number in a table, a headline in the Daily Mail doesn't necessarily consider that, and the detail is lost. And actually, one of the things that in particular does cattle and sheep a huge disservice is the fact that they are ruminants. So in terms of methane production, which is one of the big baddies in this discussion, produced by the rumen, because of that fermentation that happens in there. The reality is, whilst that might be the devil in this discussion, actually that's the engine room of these animals and enables them to utilise forages that other animals, including humans, wouldn't be able to utilise. And actually, baby out with the dishwater, we need to be careful that it's balanced. But actually, fundamentally, there are targets on our sector, and we can either embrace them or risk getting left behind. It can be really frustrating to listen to, because what we know is that in the UK, less than 10% of UK anthropogenic greenhouse gases are from agriculture. So travel, industry, all of those things are actually accounting for a much bigger percentage. And it can sometimes feel that we are perhaps an easier target. But ultimately, there's this ruminant component of it, which particularly contributes to the methane emissions. And for reference, sheep count for about 16% of those in total. But a little change within our sector could potentially have lots of positive repercussions elsewhere. So we do need to be part of this discussion, for sure. So we can only manage what we can measure. So I suspect a lot of people listening to this webinar have already gone down the route, and I'd really encourage you, if you haven't, of getting a carbon footprint done, just to and actually, in the first instance, it's quite a good sort of a bit of a health check on inputs in your business, because a huge part of all these calculators is actually your performance, your physical performance of whatever class of stock that you've got, because we know that's a really big driver of the footprint of the product that's ultimately reduced. But actually other inputs as well, and where nutrients have been imported, etc. So they're regularly available, and you can get access to them both online through vets and consultants, etc. But it's really important just to remember that there's nuances between them. Some are perhaps more appropriate, for example, at an international level. And actually, I think probably the crucial thing is that you use something that's well recognised, and you keep using the same type of model, whether that's year on year or every few years as your business evolves. But having a line in the sand is really important to start off with. But one of the things we have to be really careful with carbon footprinting or numbers in general is, so I work in the Southwest. I have no two sheep flocks the same, and the diversity within our sector is ginormous. So putting a target in terms of a number on a business it's nonsensical, really. And what we're really interested in is how your business changes from over one start of a time period to the end of it. And if you think about the challenges that our hill flocks face in contrast to lowlands, and what's appropriate production for one would be just utterly inappropriate for the other, we need to ensure that we're comparing apples with apples, and the nuance of our sheep sector is important to recognise. The other thing to recognise, and we've seen this a little bit with the antibiotic rational usage of antibiotics and reducing of that, is the sheep industry, in terms of number of holdings or number of veterinary practices that look after those holdings, is ginormous. And we don't really have an integrated system, in contrast to, for example, pigs and poultry. Now, that is our strength in some ways, if you think of the huge diversity, but also we have to recognise that when we want to make change as a body of sheep farmers, that actually that can be quite difficult, because you have to get a lot of people on board to it. So our strengths, we just need to recognise that they can present some challenge for us when we're trying to head in a given direction. Second piece of reading, if you want to read anything, if you can get access to it, was a piece of work. It's 10 years old now, but it just drew a line in the sand, and it looked at different sheep farms in different topographies, benchmarked their businesses in terms of carbon footprinting. The model, from memory, didn't look at sequestration, so it was essentially looking at what was happening above ground in terms of sheep performance, outputs, any additional inputs that were coming in, imported feed, all the rest of it. And what this paper found, which is really interesting to me, and another reason why we have to be careful about numbers, is there was almost as much variation within hill flocks, for example, as between the different categories. And there were some hill flocks who were outperforming lowland flocks in terms of physical performance, and that's really fascinating to me. I think one of the things it highlights off the bat is that we shouldn't be picking on anyone in particular. And actually, I think one of the things that came out of a couple of those reports was the people at the top with the lowest footprints actually. They've probably got less to contribute in terms of they can only make a little bit of difference because they were doing so well to start off with. But actually, the traction or the real momentum will come from changes in subtle behaviour in the bottom tier of those who had the highest carbon footprints in this measure. One of the things this project did, this modelling that it developed, was highlight some particular areas that we know make a big difference, whichever model you're in. And the 4 biggest drivers for carbon footprint on a sheep flock were number of lambs reared per ewe per year. Really important, the difference between maximum and optimum, especially when considering the diversity of sheep farms. Maximum and optimum are not necessarily the same thing. The second thing was lamb growth rate. The third thing was percentage of ewes in the flock not mated, i.e. was a flock breeding from their ewe lambs lambing as hoggets. That was a positive thing to do in terms of carbon footprint. And fourthly, the last biggest thing was concentrate usage. But again, actually, if I crossed carbon footprints out on this slide and actually started talking about profitability, well, number of lambs reared per ewe per year is going to be really important for your gross margin. Lamb growth rate, getting lambs off farm as optimally as possible, with minimum wastage, if you will, that's going to be a really important driver of the health of the business. Breeding of ewe lambs is a very farm specific action. I'm not necessarily, certainly not advocating everybody needs to do that, because that'd be a disaster for some flocks. But actually, it's, when you start reading this paper, you start thinking, well, actually, some of this stuff is that's not that new for us as sheep farmers and sheep vets thinking about healthy sheep business. Number of lambs reared per ewe also takes into account mortality and lamb loss and neonatal health. Actually, this is in our language anyway, and actually, is it as new for us as it might be sound initially? So one of the things that I'd sort of challenge you to think about is what really excites you about your sheep farming business or enterprise. What motivates you? And what I could get a group of my clients in a space together and know that I will get different answers from everybody I ask. Now, I think the public perception is sometimes that we are mercenary and it's the economics of our business that is the be all and end all. And it'll be very important for everybody, I should think. But equally, in terms of what motivates you and what gets you out of bed on that rainy day, there'll be all sorts of things. And that's, for some people, that'll include the landscape. That'll include, I know for me, a love of the animal and a real passion for working with them, an enthusiasm for breeding, the ecology on your farm, the landscape, where you fit in the community. All of those things are really important in this discussion. And I just wanted to go through an example now to show you that whatever really ticks your buttons, that actually sustainability is not in conflict with that. So the example I want to pick on in the interest of time is lamb growth rate, which was the second highest in terms of contribution to what made a sheep farm low carbon footprint or not. If we're saying that carbon footprint is the metric that our industry is being put under pressure to focus on as part of the livestock sector. So this is my only gory picture here, and for what it's worth, in the southwest, this is being recorded in October, and this is all I seem to be talking about at the moment, which is worms and lamb growth rate. And we know that lamb growth can be divided into a few key phases. So it's hugely influenced by the ewe's health, particularly in the end of pregnancy, her health going and nutrition going into early lactation, and milk yield is really important. 8-week weights to weaning is the next growth phase, and then weaning till exit from your flock, whether that's as a replacement or as a fat lamb, for example. But what we know is that parasites is one example of a flock health challenge which can influence the whole growth curve, whether it's liver fluke or sheep scab having a negative influence on ewe health and therefore lactation, whether it's coccidia or nematobidiris earlier on, or whether it's all of the worms or the vast majority of them over the grazing period. So parasites, huge challenge. So what we know, we've got parasites as a huge challenge. They're going to impact lamb growth rate, and we know that that's potentially going to have a negative impact on our carbon footprint. So a report that was released this year, which is your third piece of recommended reading, and this is the summarised version, which was the NSA's UK sheep farming and sustainability agenda. And one of the key themes that comes out very early in the report is this concept that this buzzword of sustainability only works, it's only a real thing if it is supported completely by these four fundamental pillars. So sustainability requires environmental responsibility, and that's probably the really obvious one, that's an essential part of it, but it must be coupled with economic viability. Unless this economically makes sense for the businesses that are delivering it, you're going to get minimal buy-in, and it's not going to be effective, and may actually even fall apart. So it's got to make sense economically on paper. It can't be in conflict with the business. Might involve flexing of the business, but it can't be in conflict. It's got to involve the health of people, animals, and the ecosystem. And perhaps the example I'll come to in a minute is a good example of that. And then there's the social acceptability of it as well. And that applies to both the farmers delivering it, but the public perception of that challenge. So I wanted to walk through an example of lamb growth rate, parasite control, and why no matter what excites you, whether it's the economics of this, whether it's the environmental elements, whether it's animal health, whether it's social perception, whatever you thought of a minute ago, what motivates you, well, see which pillar in particular is of interest for you in this context. So when we're talking about parasite worms on sheep farms, this paper is older than I am, but I still trot it out every time, which is it's some work that was done in 1982 where they had a group of lambs divided and exposed to different parasite burdens. And what we know is the more worms a sheep has, the slower it grows. And everyone who's farm sheep listening to this could have given me that information. But the two bottom groups, which have got the purple arrows, one of those groups was wormed. And now what we can see is that the wormed group does not restore its potential back up to the control group, which had 0 worms. It gets better than if it hadn't been wormed, but there's no restoration of performance. And actually what that's telling us is we'd far better avoid having to worm sheep. Avoiding infection is far more efficient in terms of lamb growth, lamb finishing, lamb value, carbon footprint, all of those metrics. Actually, we've got lost potential here when we've got an example of an animal health challenge that goes awry. And this is just another example from AHDB about when we know that when lambs are growing at their quickest, our feed efficiency just shoots up. It's really interesting. It's one of the reasons you need to be a bit careful when considering, for example, the concentrate discussion on a farming business, because actually if we can get optimal growth rates and lambs are off farm as quickly as possible, then we might be actually having really positive benefits in terms of overall carbon footprint. However, it does need to be interpreted in the context, and if we are going to have those inputs, the origin of them, the credibility of them, and actually making sure they're used to maximal benefit in our farm is going to be really important. But one of the things we know is that when sheep have parasitic gastroenteritis worms, it increases their greenhouse gas production by 10%. And enteric methane emissions in particular can increase as much as 30% with Tila dorsagia. And for those of you that are less familiar with the species, that's the big baddie that we manage for most of the summer months. Perhaps it's tailing off at this time of year. So actually, if we're not cracking worm control, we can see very clearly that those environmental credentials potentially are being compromised. And actually, potentially managing this better could be the gift that keeps on giving. So environmentally, carbon footprint, looking at getting worm control right makes sense. Okay, so what about the economics of it? So a piece of work from New Zealand which compared For argument's sake, they compared treatment of lambs in a group where half of the lambs, they knew they had worms, half of them gave them an effective wormer, and half of them were given a wormer that was known to be ineffective, i.e. there was resistance there. And they compared the physical performance of those two groups of lambs on farm. And what they saw over the grazing season was a nearly 5 kilo reduction in live weight of lambs that had been treated with an ineffective wormer all season, reduced the carcass value at that exit point by 10%, dirty fleeces, and knocked nearly 20 days off finishing time. Okay, so we can play a little bit with that, and we can start putting some money on it. So I know at the practice, and this number's possibly a bit out of date now, we've got probably more, but call it, at the time we had 62,000 breeding ewes. If we talk about a rearing percentage of 140%, which if you look at the literature is a very much a national average number, I appreciate it'll vary if you start going up to hills, etc. But in a given year, nearly 90,000 lambs can be reared at the practice. Actually, if you then start saying that 40% of those lambs are on a holding that have triple resistance, and that's the kilograms of lamb that is effectively missing. If I do a very crude calculation to convert it to live weight as opposed to dead weight rather, then actually I can see very easily that there's over 500,000 kilos of missing lamb. Probably, lamb price got better than that this season, didn't it? And actually, that's just in my practice. And if I challenge you to how much your vet's charging you for a worm egg count, or how much an hour with them would cost at a parasite control plan, it's a lot of time. So and it's a lot of money, and this is a really expensive issue. So actually, if it's money that it particularly chimes with you, if the economics have to stack up, then getting this right is a no-brainer from that perspective. Okay, well, the next pillar, so health of animals, people and ecosystem. So really loads of enthusiasm and interest for dung beetles and all the other inhabitants that live and are supported on our farms. And I'm hoping I can remember the numbers for this because I thought this was particularly fascinating. So Dartmoor Hill Farm Project, and all the data for this is summarised in the NSA's report, looked at dung beetle density in given volumes of faeces, and with all the environmental benefits and indications that dung beetles and bats tell us about what's happening on the farm. They found that the density of dung beetles in sheep faeces in particular was doubled more than ponies. It outstripped what cattle dung was there. Our sheep are producing some really good stuff. But what we also know is because of the challenge we have about parasitic gastroenteritis, anthelmintic usage presents a challenge for these other ecosystems that are thriving and surviving on our farms. Now, I probably sit on this in a little bit of a position of balance, which is fundamentally, if we have sheep that are unwell, sick, not performing, there's an environmental piece there about why it's actually really important to treat them effectively with products that work. But for all the reasons I've already said earlier, actually getting into a bit of a cycle of a necessity to treat, actually that doesn't make sense from a sheep farming business perspective, never mind whether dung beetles or bats excite you. Actually, remember that work from 1982, that's lost growth rate, or that's if we're using wormers that don't work and might even be exposing our insect fauna on farm, actually we might be losing loads of money. So there might be a scenario where if we've not got this singing on farm, actually it's really not working for anybody, and it might not be working for our other life cycles on farm as well. So food for thought. So if this is what excites you, then cracking a sustainable worm control plan on farm makes sense for you as well. And what we know, I think I alluded to it earlier, is that actually fundamentally for me, I work with farming businesses who want to keep being farming businesses on those farms. And triple resistance, or quadruple resistance as it's referred to in this particular paper from Wales, I think is the biggest threat, apart from economic challenge. But I think this is the biggest animal health threat, which might mean that there are some members of the audience today who might not be farming on their farm because it's extremely difficult to do so because of the worm challenge. So actually, it makes sense for the custodianship of that business, whether or not dung beetles excite you, whether or not carbon footprint excite you, whether or not cash excites you. Actually, there's real sensible reasons to crack this from that perspective as well. And then social acceptability. This is probably slightly more obvious when we think about things like lameness or really visible challenges, but ultimately sustainable parasite control, everything that we've just said before, are very topical. Mortality, etc., can be a real drain on a sheep business, and I think also, notwithstanding quite a lot of these issues, and as I said earlier, my phone's ringing off the hook at the moment with worm management challenges. It's really quite draining for the people that are involved as well, and actually is a really important way of cracking this can really sort of contribute to the whole picture of sustainable production. But one thing I'd just like to take a step back, or get you to take a step back from, is actually sensible worm control and the benefit for your business, whether you consider your business as part of, just for a moment, to consider it as a bit of an island. You've probably been talking about this with your vet for a really long time. It'll have been progressing constantly. Our knowledge is progressing constantly. But actually, we think about sustainable production all the time. It's really important for us. We know, we can see firsthand with our anthelmintic resistance challenge what happens if it goes wrong or it goes awry. And we're also used to thinking about what comes in and out of our farms in terms of parasite control, but it applies to all the other issues as well. We're aware of the challenges that it has on production. So I guess what I'm challenging you to say or challenging us all to just remember, is that it might sound a bit different, some of the sustainability discussion, especially as it gets ramped up in the media, but I think we've done a lot of really positive stuff already, and it's continued to evolve. So as an example, in summary, sustainable parasite control, insert here whatever phrase excites you. The reality is they're all right, and if you're focusing on one element of it, you probably are catching all the other things too. And in essence, it's an integral part of what we're doing. We were here first, I guess, is what I'm saying. Just my last closing two slides is, as part of the CL report, these were the strategies that came out of key action points or areas to focus on. What I've just talked about largely is about improving efficiency, but there are a couple, there's another area, and if we stick with the worm example going forward, there's another couple of areas that are evolving all the time, and will be there to help us, and it's our role to sort of embrace them, really. Let me mute my sheep farmer. So technology and precision livestock farming has been key in all of those reports, and this is just an example of a video. It's targeted selective treatment. So these are lambs that have been weighed, and they're now being reweighed after a given interval, and they're being drafted based on what their growth rate is of those lambs. And anthelmintics are being targeted at the lambs that will benefit the most from that treatment. And the ones that are performing quite nicely with the challenge that they've got are being left untreated. Really sensible from an anthelmintic preservation perspective, really sensible if you get excited about dung beetles, and hopefully maximizing performance as well. So technology is evolving all the time, and keep your ear to the ground. The last slide from me is, so I put together with some colleagues a concept about how we approach parasite control, and it's this idea that it's a process. It doesn't start with a treatment, doesn't even start with a worm egg count. It starts with thinking about our flock, and essentially using our flock health plan to its maximum benefit to create this idea of a process. And in a nutshell, it nicely spelt the word game, but I need to have an animal that's got good genetics and good general health status. I then want to avoid infection, so I want to put it in the place on my farm which has got the lowest exposure. I then need to monitor, everybody needs to monitor, whether that's growth rates or worm egg count control. And only at that point in the discussion should I really be thinking about, well, what worm am I actually going to reach for when I get there? And that's just how I personally approach creating a parasite control plan on farm. But G is the place that you've got to start. And general health will have a huge impact on the sheep's ability to withstand infection. But genetics, and genetics for parasite control, as an example, will be a huge driver potentially of the sustainability of whichever metric you looked at, were inspired by growing in the face of worm challenge, or coping with given burdens. There's a lot of work being done by a lot of the maternal breeds in particular looking at this, and my recommendation is always to seek breeds, particularly in a maternal context, where there is some of that information, whether it's blood testing for things like IgA or individual fecal egg counts. And fundamentally, buying sheep that have got performance figures is always to be recommended. But as both a farmer and a vet involved in the Breed for Change project, which is pulling everything really that I've said together, so looking, there's the genetic element to it. Fundamentally, it's based on performance recording, but also looking at, well, where does parasite control fit into that? Where does weight fit into that? And where does what how a interacts, what our body condition score does with that, amongst all sorts of different other factors. It's a huge project. I think the point I wanted to make really is make sure that your sheep, you might be doing a lot of hard work, make sure your sheep is working with you, and genetics and general health, because there's other things that contribute to that, are really important as well. And actually, if I reflect, I've been qualified for 12 years, how things have evolved in the time I've been in practice. All of this necessity drives innovation, and watch this space and be open-minded to it. So my summary messages are: we've got an expanding population, and we need to feed them with good quality protein. And efficiency of production, the profitability of that, and the environmental impact of that production are totally and utterly intertwined. And it's dangerous, and nobody wants to separate them. But actually, knowing that whichever two of those three or one of those three really is important for you, by proxy, there's a necessity to think about the second or third one. Going back to those metrics and putting numbers on, knowing where your baseline is for your business is really important, because I'm not interested in your performance relative to anybody else, but I'm interested in your performance relative to self. And it's totally linked with flock health, and if you can see progress in a given direction. Animal health, we know, is a key driver of greenhouse gas sustainability, and just one example, worms, there today, but I could have picked enumerate more, and lameness is the next easy one to pick on, or infertility in the sheep flock. Multiple packages are aware for greenhouse gas footprinting. Speak to your vets or consultants. Nuances between them all, like say apples and apples, is really important. And lastly, I hope I've sort of outlined, not least with my enthusiasm, but vets can really help in positively influencing flock health. And I think one of the things, I was at my closing thought there, I was at a conference recently, and I'll credit Joe Henry gave me this thought from Black Sheep Vets, but I did a bit of Googling, and I think if you look in the Financial Times, there's an article about time management on farms, but it just really struck a chord with me. It was the concept of time spent working on the business versus time spent working in the business. And I think, and if I reflect my home farming as much as anybody else's, we're all time poor, and we spend all of our time working on time in the business, and if we have a bit of spare time, then we try and diversify and fill that time with something else. But one of the things that really struck me was a flock health plan, a time spent sat with your vet or your advisor, just reflecting on the business, some sat still time, sharing ideas, being creative, challenging the status quo. That's time working on your business, and it's really valuable for all sorts of different reasons. And I would challenge us all working with sheep that actually, if we spend some of that time just sitting still going, what are we, if we were challenged at a dinner party, if we were challenged about what we are already doing on our business that's already making a difference and that's really important to the sustainability, remembering those 4 pillars, then I have every confidence that we could all we could all start with a really nice list. It might be that there's a bit of room to go, but actually I think there's some positivity there to start with. So my answer is sustainability in terms of the context of a discussion on a sheep farm, friend or foe. Old friend would be my answer to that. And nobody likes change and evolution, but actually the sheep sector, and if you look at worms and resistance as a mere example, the sheep sector is well placed to embrace change because it's something we're so used to doing. So old friend. So just those last three references in particular, really recommend the NSA's report's brand new this year, but the CL report really outlines the other sectors as well. And if anyone can get access to that original paper, although it's referenced throughout all the literature, so don't worry too much if you can't get it directly. And that's everything from me.
Claire, thank you. Sorry, Claire. Emily, thank you so much for that really impassioned and engaging presentation. I'm sure everybody watching fully enjoyed what you had to say. I know I certainly did. And we haven't got much time, but I just wanted to, if I may, ask you a few more questions that hopefully might be useful for people viewing to hear more from you on. So in no particular order, I was really interested in what you were talking about with regard to the quality of protein. And I just wonder if we could put a consumer hat on for a second. And it got me thinking about how, we discuss the different quality of grazing and the ability of sheep to turn, otherwise unuseful land into great quality protein for humans. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on how we help the consumer to get that message, because I think sometimes that doesn't necessarily land. And I think we have an opportunity to say, look, here's how sheep are incredibly useful, and here's how we can get great quality protein from something that otherwise would not be useful.
Yeah. Oh, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? And I don't know that I necessarily have the answer off the cuff. I think one of the challenges we face, and I conclude myself in this thinking about our sheep business at home, the people that eat the meat that I produce, I will never meet, unless you're in a box meat type system. We are separated from our consumer as well, aren't we? So it's, in terms of what we can do at the farm gate, for many that will be very, very limiting. However, I think it's important that as farmers we are familiar with some of the stuff and more that I've just chatted about, and in a position to not be defensive but to defend and justify. And I saw an interview on can't remember what this week, and it just, sometimes I think loud voices on the opposite side can totally drown out our messaging really easily if they're particularly emphatic. I think it's really important that we own our subject, that we are proud of it, and when we have an opportunity to challenge that we do. I think in terms of within our industry, I think the levy boards have obviously got a really important role to play and do a lot. They're much nearer the people that buy our product, and the same applies to probably some of the processes as well, and there's lots of work that's been done across the sector in that instance. So I think, for lack of a better term, I think being loud and proud about what we are doing. Not everybody can be on social media, not everybody has the time or space to do that, but even in your 7 degrees of separation of people that I think being familiar with the subjects and I think one of the things that's really important is real honesty in terms of this discussion. So actually there's probably some things that have come out in today that use of wormers and anthelmintic resistance. there could be criticism landed at us there quite easily and readily for some of that, and actually historically for sure, and actually, but that's okay, and we can own that, and we can reflect on, you know, things that we might want to do differently going forward, and how science has changed and our knowledge has changed, and that's okay. Acknowledging change and progress is okay too. So sorry, I don't know that I had the actual answer there, but I think as an individual farmer, understanding, trying to get some understanding of the battle, you know, of the challenges landed at our door, being familiar with those, understanding them for your farm, and then be willing to support and engage with the levy bodies, etc., National Sheep Association, because they've got they've got huge remit and the processes as well. So sorry, I don't know that I have the answer, but
I think that was really thoughtful and insightful answer, Emily. I think that was excellent, which leads me quite neatly, because you touched in the presentation, but also in your answer there, around parasite control plans, and I'm really interested in your thoughts as a vet on the sort of farmer's way of thinking, or should I say, making the connection between their animal health and therefore the sustainability of the protein that they're producing, because I think sometimes my sense is that can also sometimes be lost. And when you consider that many farmers are, you know, the health of their flock is everything to them, you know, and both from a commercial reason, but also for talking about your motivations, which is something else I'd love to come on to, I think is really important, because I don't think any farmer sets out to have an unhealthy flock. So with that in mind, what are your thoughts, or what do you see among your clients with regard to health relating to sustainability?
It's hugely variable, but so I think one of the points I was sort of trying to get to at the presentation is the word sustainability or sustainable production is probably, if you earwigged all my flock health planning discussions, that word that would probably not be used that often. However, we talk about it all the time. Does that make sense? So
it does.
So actually, although there are obviously nuances with what markets people are trying to hit when they're finishing lambs, etc., but having slower growing, even if we come away from sort of animal ill health and just look at animals not performing as well as they should do, that's not in anybody's sort of remit, if that, you know, that's not what nobody wants that. So actually, I think I guess that's what I wanted to sort of get at, really. I think we are all talking about it all the time. Now, whether the ultimate carbon footprint of the packet in the supermarket shelf is the vocabulary that's being used, in reality, it's not. But it is there by proxy, does that make sense?
It does.
So we think about it all the time. It just might not be the words that are coming out.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense and will resonate with a lot of people watching this, Emily. So I've just got a couple more questions, and we're really thankful to you, Emily, for your time. I know that you're an extremely busy and in-demand vet, so I'll try and keep this as brief as I possibly can.
Go for it.
But I really wanted to pick up on what you were talking about, health checks on inputs, because I think there was something really interesting there, and it speaks very much to the farmer who perhaps is sensitive to the bottom line. And I wonder, do we need to think about carbon footprinting from a health check on inputs point of view? Because if that is one measure that resonates with many farmers, you know, and I'll supplement this by saying you talked a lot about the economic viability of the business, which of course must be talked about in the context of sustainability, because if we don't have sustainable farms, we don't have sustainable businesses, we don't have food. So
sure.
My question really, Emily, is, do you think a point of entry for a farmer who is really approaching this maybe for the first time is that why don't we just look at inputs, as the first thing we do, have we got a good health check on inputs? Are we doing the right thing? And wow, look at the difference you can make by just focusing on that one thing as a first thing to do. There's a question in there somewhere, Emily. I wonder if you could speak
no,
to
that's
that.
fine. Unfortunately, I'm a vet, which means that my as a vet, my brain is just programmed to automatically start with outputs, if I'm honest, because actually, when I sit down and do my health plan with you, I want to know what your scanning is, I want to know what your rearing percentage is. But whether we're talking about carbon footprinting or the bottom economic line of a business, actually, and if you look at Stop doing it now, or Farm Bench does it, but if you look at stock take, what we know for probably all businesses, but it is so pertinent to the sheep sector, is it almost I was about to say it doesn't matter what your output is. That's not true, but actually offsetting your costs and inputs, you can have a very a medium output flock that is far more profitable because of what the inputs are. And I think reflecting on that cake example as well, putting cake into a sheep farm, actually it's about bang for your buck. So actually, in the context of putting cake into finishing lambs, well, you might totally transform their efficiency of production. You might get them off farm quicker. It's not necessarily going to be you have to do the numbers on it, but it doesn't necessarily assume that it's going to be a bad thing in this context. So my natural language would be to start at outputs, and you should you need to have those anyway. But I think in terms of I suppose I'd encourage people, and I think this is probably what you're getting at, is to challenge their inputs. So I keep picking on concentrate feeding, but it's probably the most elegant one. So what is your concentrate bill for the last 12 months? What was that investment? Did you get as much out? Did you get a return on that investment? And could you have done it in a different way? Could you have invested in forages differently on farm? Or actually, are you getting your forage analysed and actually there's big improvements to be made there? Could you reduce your cake bill by getting a ration actually done, which is not that expensive? And are there other feed sources that you can put in? So I guess my answer is probably I have to start with physical output. Sorry, I'm just programmed that way. But yes, I think there's real merit in just challenging the inputs. And even if you don't change anything, can you justify them in the context of what you're actually getting in return for them? Are you getting bang for your buck? Yeah. And if not, there's an inefficiency there, and that's perhaps a good place to start in terms of troubleshooting.
Yeah, and of course it's all holistic as well, isn't it? Because if you don't have a parasitic control plan, then the inputs, I don't want to say are irrelevant. That wouldn't be true, but you've got to look at the whole thing in a bit of a 360. Just conscious of the last remaining moments we got to speak together, right, Emily. So one last thing I wanted to ask you. Again, I was fascinated by your the section of your presentation talking about social capital in sheep farming, which I don't think gets enough attention, and I think it's the sort of area of interest that I see developing. And of course we have a new professor here at Harper Adams, actually, Professor David Christian Rose, who is focused on the social impacts. And I just really wondered if you could just develop a little bit more on what you talked about around the social capital in sheep farming, because I think it's not something that's widely spoken about, and I think we need to do it more. Could you share some more with us, Emily?
Yeah, I have to try and be careful not to make it sound too romanticized, but whether you look at the family farms that the people are almost as hefted to the landscape as the sheep might be in those parts of the world, Or you look at the total other end of the scale of the brand new entrant for whom sheep, we have to recognise the importance of the sheep sector in terms of getting people into agriculture. And it's really important. So whether it's somebody that's brand new or, have the hills that they farm walking, running through their veins, I think there's perspective there in both of those extremes. There's skill sets there. There's, even I hit the farmers that I work with, their knowledge of the landscape, and it's just, that's very difficult to capture in any other format. There's real history there. And I think one of the things, that sheep farming is one of the oldest industries, isn't it? All over the world. And we have to recognise, I think yesterday morning I went checking my sheep and it was absolutely chucking it down. And most rational people probably wouldn't do that. There's a real love for a species that has to be there in order to justify us doing some of the things we do sometimes as sheep farmers and as vets. And actually, going back to the rumen being the engine room of the sheep, and in the same way, the people on these farms are so important to affecting change and inspiring them, and using language, which I've hoped to do today, which is actually, we're doing a lot of this stuff. We might need to develop it a bit and we might need to communicate about it differently, but there's some real positivity there. They are the people are the engine room for the change of this, and recognizing the diversity of motivations amongst them is important if you want to get as many people to come with you on that journey. But it's as a sheep vet, I said earlier, I'm 90 if not 100% sheep work, but the percentage of time I actually spent touching or hands-on doing work with sheep is a fraction of that, and the big proportion of that is working with, challenging, hopefully inspiring, pushing, investing in the people. And this, for me, this is just another extension of that, really. So people, in some ways, I'd expand the NSA's infographic, which I'd put people as the bedrock of that pillar system, because unless that isn't, you can't affect any of that change without them. And I think sometimes when I listen to interviews on social media, or I see sort of Gareth Winchester, defending his work, and there's loads of other examples, I just thought, what a missed opportunity. The side of the argument that's sort of really challenging us, and challenge is not a bad thing, but actually if it ignores the social capital element of it and bringing people with us, then actually it's just conflict, isn't it? And I don't know that that's helpful for anybody. So it's people are the absolute bedrock of affecting change on this subject, in my humble opinion.
Well, it's a reasoned and well thought out argument. So I'm sure our viewers noted it, but I'm going to just underline your lovely comment that people are the engine room for change, was I think the phrase you used, and I couldn't agree more. I think that's a perfect place to end. So Emily, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
We're extremely grateful to you. I know that people are going to get a lot of value from what they've heard today, so thank you again for sharing it with us, and we'll see everybody on the next one. Thanks, Emily.
That's my pleasure.